Hi, my name's Alex. I'm a freelance web developer here in Berlin. And first off, thanks to the JSConf team for having me here. This is my first really properly big audience, and it's a great honor to be here. And thanks to all of you for your interest and time. So, a brief disclaimer before we start. As she just said, I work on a no backend project called Hoodie. And so this whole topic is very close to my heart. And the few code examples I do have actually come from Hoodie. But there's going to be very little code, and it's not going to be self-promotional in any way, so don't worry about it. So what I'm talking about is this no backend idea, a new paradigm in front-end web development, which some are calling no backend, and which includes the idea of having a backend as a service. And essentially what it boils down to is that you can build a full-featured, data-driven web application on the browser side and not worry what goes on the server. Now, I don't know about you, but to me this sounds very desirable. I'm primarily a front-end developer, but in practice, of course, I'm not. I'm a both-end developer, as probably many of you are, because we don't really have any choice. At some point, 95% of everything I build requires some sort of data storage or user authentication. And so I can either just slog through and build a backend, I can hire, bribe, coerce, or somehow otherwise convince someone to build it for me, or I can just give up and do something else. So if this is a big commercial thing, you're probably not going to have to worry about this because somebody else is paying for number two. But if you're just prototyping an idea, or if you're building something that solves a small personal problem, or for just small projects in general, option number two is often out of scope. And option number three is depressing. So you're probably going to try and do it yourself. And then you'll be looking at this. So I can sit down and I can deal with all that. I mean, I can work with these things, but at the same time, these are all jobs. Other people's jobs, thankfully. They make a living with this, and they know it really well, and while I can use PHP and Rails and find a server-side framework and set up a database and all that, I could probably hack something together that would work, but it wouldn't be very good, it would take me too long, and most importantly, I just don't want to. It's not my job, it's not my expertise, I probably wouldn't enjoy it, and I would probably find a way to make terrible security mistakes. So really, what do I need? I mean, in most cases, my requirements, and indeed most people's requirements at a basic level, are relatively simple. What you want is you want to have users, so they can sign in, sign out, and do user stuff. You want to be able to administer them and send them new passwords when something goes wrong. You want to let them save and load data, because otherwise, what's the point? You want to let them share the data with each other or with the public, maybe send an email or two, and ideally even let them pay me for it. That's not particularly outlandish. People have been doing this for a very long time. It's so unspectacular, I'd actually go and call it boring. It's not exactly particle physics, because this is particle physics, and particle physics is dictated by the real world. The web is not. It is dictated by what people think how it should work. So this stuff, I think it shouldn't be difficult. I think it only should take a couple of minutes. So we're used to doing stuff like this in the DOM, you know, just manipulating an element with jQuery. So why can't signing up a user be similarly simple? Why can't we just go and do that? So that's where the no backend idea comes in. Basically makes that possible. It's essentially about delegation. It turns something that is difficult and full of pitfalls into a commodity where the tricky and/or dull bits are handled by other people who are better at it than you are. And this makes sense because we do it all the time in all aspects of life. So I doubt that any of you do their distributed version control by themselves. Most of us go here. When something goes wrong with our plumbing, we call a plumber, and when something goes wrong with other dirty things, we call a lawyer. So why can't we do this with backends? Backends are hard. They're made up of a lot of different components that all have to interact with each other. There's a variety of languages and syntax, and even the simplest setup. There are arcane conventions that go back 30 years, and layers of obtuse, compounded weirdness that really takes ages to wrap your head around. And that's before you get a single user and start scaling. And really, that sounds like the first thing I'd want to get rid of. And you can get rid of it. So by now, there are architectures and services that more or less let you forget about the backend and let you build these complete data-driven web applications from the client side, all in JS. And some of them have really nifty features, like real-time data binding or offline capabilities. So what they do is they turn your backend into a black box with an API. So no backend is really a bit of a misnomer. Of course, there's a backend, you have to put the stuff somewhere. But it's not something you have to worry about if you don't want to. OK. So my 3 lines of code examples, I just showed you this a minute ago. Actually, I didn't show you exactly that, but very nearly that. So that's no backend code. It runs in the front end, and it does exactly like what it looks like it does. You can do that a few seconds after you've scaffolded out your project in whatever no backend services you're using. And that's a real thing. That's code from Hoodie. You can use that today, and it creates a proper user account. It authenticates that user, and then you can start storing data. And storing data doesn't look too different. I mean, there's a store object, it has an add method, and you give it data. And it's just a type in JSON. And you'll notice that there's no setting up a database. There are no schemas. There is no config. If you want to store data, you store data. Go ahead. The infrastructure gets out of your way. Want to send a multi-part email from the browser? Go ahead. It's 2013. You can send a multi-part email from the browser. Why the hell not? So that's a nice example of the no backend philosophy. It's all about the API. It's all front-end-centric. The actual implementation of sending that email might be complicated. It might not be complicated. Why should we care? It's sending an email. It's not that interesting. It should just be a thing that you call, and then it works. So just to wrap all that up, no backend is essentially a design paradigm for architectures and frameworks that abstracts complex backend operations and technology into a simple-to-use REST API. And as I said, there is a backend, but you don't have to deal with it if you don't want to. And of course, most of these services are extensible, so you can add functionality with plugins or packages. So that all sounds pretty good, and I think you get the idea, and that's all the code you're going to see from me today. So what I really want to talk about is why this is cool, and then what I really want to talk about is why it's important. So what's cool is it makes web development simple and accessible. So all of these things, oh, sorry, just a second. All of these solutions typically come either as a service that's hosted somewhere or as an installable package that just includes everything. You run it, and you get your server, your database, you just get all of it. And that's a very quick setup, it's very easy, and it's a very low barrier to entry. In essence, you download a thing, you double-click it, and you've got a development environment. That's very convenient. So ideally, and this is, for example, the case in Hoodie, where you used to have a tech stack with multiple languages and data formats and maybe even several databases and a query language and server configurations, you now have one language, JavaScript, all the way through. And you have one data format, JSON, all the way through. It doesn't matter where you access it, everything is JavaScript and JSON. That's really nice. Even the config files are JSON, which is cool. And you often get very simple built-in deployment mechanisms. This goes so far that sometimes it's simply just a button in a web interface that says deploy, and then you click it, and it's deployed. And that's a wonderful user experience for a developer, really. So everything's really, really quick to get going. And in general, speed is a great factor because there's very little config and boilerplate. You can start doing substantial things almost immediately. There's nothing standing in the way of your ideas and the interesting problems of your app, which is what the user does with your app. You can just go. That's very nice. And as I said, most of these solutions have additional perks like offline mode or live sync between devices, or this nice reactive use thing, which is actually called the live data binding. If something gets changed in one user's view, all the other connected users get that immediately. And the cool thing is, that's not something you have to invoke in most cases. It's just automatically the baseline of how these things work. So you save ages not implementing that yourself. So that, of course, lends itself to rapid prototyping, because you can build these things and you can churn them out so quickly that you can just use real data, real behaviors, and give your test users real devices. You don't have to muck about with cards or dummies or something. It's so fast, you can actually build real working prototypes with this. But let's get back to that first point, the focus. You start developing in the browser near the user where the unique aspects of your app are. So you build the user-facing features quickly. You validate or dismiss them. You experiment, you pivot at will, and you don't have to worry about the infrastructure, setting it up, or how it's configured or anything. You can just go and find out whether the idea is actually worth spending time on without spending a lot of time on the infrastructure. Now, backend solutions bring some interesting aspects in with regard to flexibility. So many of these let you host wherever you like, as they should. But since they're so easy to install, that could also mean you just have a box that sits in a corner of your office. And there you can have auto-updating, self-hosted, and secure, device-independent enterprise software just running on a box in the corner of your office. And it's just as easy to install as the development environment. And that's actually becoming a popular idea right now. So here's a nice quote. We spend so much time on the internet that we should all have our own digital home online. So far, we're only guests in a couple of gigantic hotels. And he's right, and no backend can provide a nice vector to get away from that. What it can also do is, if we can agree on some sort of convention, backends become swappable commodities, because all you ever talk to is the API, and if the APIs are the same across various backends, you can just switch them at will. You can use a local one, something you host yourself, something that's hosted by a commercial service. It's easy to switch. What goes on behind it isn't important. But no backend offers some new approaches to old problems as well, and my favorite one by far is the idea of having one backend per user. So you, as a developer, build your app as static HTML, host it on a GitHub page, for example, and each user hosts their own data themselves on Dropbox, on Google Drive, with remote storage, or whatever. And there's plenty of application business models that lend themselves to this type of architecture, namely those where the users don't share stuff that much. And this has a couple of great advantages. Sorry. First of all, scales really easily because you don't have the data. Secondly, data privacy is easier to guarantee because, again, you don't have the data. And the other cool thing is multiple apps can access, or could access, the same user's data stores. So, much like something like a Google Calendar, where you have to muck about with CalDAV and all sorts of things, you could have that in a more easier way with a no backend app. So each user could have only one calendar, one address book, one to-do list, but different apps talk to them. And they own their data, it's on their servers, but the servers expose an API to the apps. So I think all of this sounds pretty cool. I think it potentially brings a large increase in simplicity and comfort to the work we do. But for me, that's coincidental, really. It's not the underlying point. The point where I think this gets valuable is that I think the internet is unwell and no backend could help. So let's go back in time for a second. Most of you probably know what this is. This is the Arpanet at some point in the past, I think the 80s. No, 1977. OK. The idea of the Arpanet was connect geographically distributed computing resources, because computing was expensive and, well, it just makes sense to connect them. Forget about all the nuking stuff. But it was important that the connections be reliable because the equipment was crap back then. It was all bespoke and kept breaking, and the telephone lines or whatever, how they connected them were also terrible. And so we got packet switching and TCP/IP, and we also got this mental image of the distributed network. Now, on a technical level, that's still accurate, of course. That's how the web works, more or less, in practice, though the individual nodes are not of equal size and importance. So this is more what the internet actually looks like in terms of traffic. So the big ones are exactly what you'd expect. The biggest one is Google.com. Many of the smaller big ones are also Google. And the second big one is Facebook, Yahoo, and Apple, and stuff like that. So lots of traffic goes through relatively few, relatively large nodes. And this means, in the classical sense of a distributed network, that they are significant points of failure, potentially. Not necessarily in this reliability sense that they had back in the 70s, in that they'd just stop routing their packets around and everything would break, but in a more general security sense. So if an antagonistic third party can access anyone's data in one of those nodes, they must be considered broken. And as we know, this is the case. So ideally, the web, even the social web, is properly distributed to avoid these kinds of things in the future. And now Tim Berners-Lee puts it like this. He says, we must make what I call social machines. Why he calls them that, I have no idea, in which people can collaborate together, but do so in a way that's decentralized, not based on a central hub. And that's so terribly obvious, I feel bad just putting it up there because I think we can all agree on that. But how would it work? So here's an interesting idea. This guy dreams of a future where everybody has their own server, just not the way you think of it, a rack somewhere. But it could be your computer at home, a little box next to your TV, a gaming console, a small server somewhere in the data center, maybe. It's not important. It would be like having a mobile phone. In fact, it might even be your mobile phone, because it's connected all the time anyway, and you're not going to get that much traffic on it. So your own server would be so easy to use and easily integrated with your existing devices that even your granny would have one. So that's a nice dream. But intrinsically, no backend technology can be really helpful here, because it can help redistribute apps and user data away from central nodes and large single points of failure. And it can decrease the number of data silos which don't talk to each other and people always complain about. And it can, through this, enhance data security and sovereignty. And what it can also do is provide more infrastructural independence from these large, compromised services with their own agendas by turning backends into commodities. But what it can also do, because of the low barrier to entry, is empower people to build and/or run their own localized tools and solve their own problems. And I also think what's really cool is it brings together the best part of browser-based applications and locally installed software. So browser-based is cool because it's browser-based. You can run it on anything that can run a browser. That's a huge advantage. But you can also have it running locally and storing your data locally and not talking to anyone if you're concerned about security implications. So that's all pretty neat. But the crucial problem is all this self-hosting, the app developing, the one backend per user, it has to compete with the incredibly polished products of enormous companies. So at any given moment, Facebook is looking for at least 3 UX people. And they already have, I don't know how many, quite a few. So these ideas have to compete on the levels of functionality, user experience, design, critical user mass is always a big problem, and convenience, all of which are perceived as more important than security, which fits in well with one of the talks we had earlier. Security is not perceived easily or that well. So this whole idea is a bit of a hard sell, and we're not going to get there by continuing to build stuff by nerds for nerds. We've got to make it easy, convincing, and enjoyable to move our personal data away from the big players. It has to be as enticing as leaving MySpace. So we need great self-hosted applications, which we can use to manage our emails, personal pictures, and all the other stuff. Incidentally, he's on next. I didn't even know that until today. But what this means in the end is that we have to build better tools, simpler tools that make this kind of computing more accessible. And this is our job as JS people, because the browser is not only a document viewer anymore, it's becoming the world's most advanced, widely distributed application runtime. And that's actually quite cool, because that's something most people are already familiar with. And it's a great chance to empower people to code and produce things they can actually use in the modern world, in their world, on any device with a browser, just like they do today. So no backend removes what I consider a very high barrier of entry. So the white dog is us, that's everyone else. So, and that barrier is high, because the simplest form of it... You can look at that a bit, I'll take a drink. Do I have to take that down? No. OK. The simplest form of a web application that a beginner might be able to deploy at some point requires you to write HTML, CSS, possibly JavaScript, PHP, and MySQL. That's the standard kind of beginner setup people have. So people work highly paid full-time jobs just doing the first two. And that may not seem so bad to us, but to most people that might as well be actual rocket science. So just getting that set up remotely and locally and having the two talk to each other, that will deter, if not defeat, most beginners. And so, like water and electricity, humans usually go the path of least resistance, and in many cases, that's Google Docs. And so they just find someone else to solve their problems instead of trying to solve them themselves. So by supporting these complexities and reveling in our arcane skills, we're helping to turn the web into old media in a way. Because while we had the patience and the will to suffer through all this adversity of learning these unknown and difficult things, programming was a new and exciting mystery, at least when I started with it, and a mystery it still is. And the web was uncharted and being created underfoot, and new stuff popped up all the time. And we kind of expected hardships because everything was new and there was a new frontier beyond which there was only science fiction and imagination. And most people around us had no idea that what we were doing was even possible or existed in the world. And I can completely understand that at some point we felt like we earned this power and they didn't. But today, computing and the web are very prevalent in our daily social lives and the lives of most people on Earth who are somehow connected. But for many of them, the web has always been there. Many have never felt that same urge to make because what they wanted was already there. When I started with computers, that's all I got. And that might be the same for many of you. You were practically required to dive in and to try and to fail and to try and to fail again and again and again and build stuff yourself because nothing existed. And that's not the case today. For most people today, the web isn't the participatory medium it could be. Yes, they upload terabytes of video a minute and tens of thousands of Instagram pictures and years of audio, but that's content. They're not making the web, they're using it. That's completely understandable because nobody's giving them much incentive to do anything else. But that's not the point of the web, is it? The web isn't just for web developers. The web is an amazing system that can do so much for so many. And yet to most people right now, it's a photo scrapbook where you tell the government where you're with and with whom. So we're letting one of the greatest feats of human ingenuity degenerate into a lifestyle magazine that spies on you. And that's sad. And I think one way to remedy this is to put creative power of making the web back into the hands of the individuals, which is the point of the web all along. So Tim Berners-Lee at the Olympics, this is for everyone. And he meant both. He meant the internet and the Olympics, but yeah. And when he says everyone, he means everyone. He doesn't just mean professionals and corporations, everyone. And there are notable precedents for efforts to put computing power back into the hands of amateurs. So in the 1980s, we got HyperCard from Apple, which aimed to do exactly that. So the makers of HyperCard have said they got programming questions from every kind of person, small business owners, school teachers, ski bums, taxi drivers, and it let non-programmers build simple apps. And so a lot of apps were created that would not have been created if app creation was left in the hands of professional developers. Because many of these apps were tailored to do exactly what the creator needed at that very moment. And that wouldn't have happened if some programmer had drawn up a spec based on some marketing research, for example. Interestingly enough, HyperTalk is apparently what inspired Brendan Eich when writing JavaScript. Now, I can't ask him anymore because he left already. But what's interesting is back then, there were even hardware add-ons for HyperCard that could exchange signals with external devices, much like the Arduino or the Tesla, which just got funded this month. And that was ages ago. What happened? I mean, and even before that, there was Smalltalk, 70s, which was similarly appealing to a wide range of people, but that back then nobody had the hardware. But the software existed. And that doesn't look too bad. It looks a tiny bit like CoffeeScript with this pleasant lack of curly braces and semicolons and everything. But the coolest thing is it was easy to learn, and that thing was an integrated editor, debugger, execution view thing. So you ran that, and that was it. You could go. Very low barrier of entry. So Smalltalk and HyperCard were interesting because they made programming accessible, and people from all walks of life could actually take advantage of these new powers of technology that were turning up everywhere. Except back then, nobody had the hardware. But what's the equivalent of that today? I think it's front-end web technology and JavaScript. You can write, run, debug, and use your code in one place, in the browser. You can modify the code while it's running. It's platform independent. It's networked. You can distribute it via the web. And anyone who can find it can probably run it as well. And you can even fly drones and control other hardware with it. There's no limit to what you can do with it by now. That's a very powerful tool. So what we should be doing is making powerful tools accessible and easy to set up and quick to get started and delivered with encouragement and enthusiasm instead of kept to ourselves with monkish elitism. So learning to program should be about play. It should be about getting things running quickly. and just seeing what happens and poking stuff and not setting up servers and stuff like that. And I think no backend technology can be extremely helpful in this regard. So helpful, in fact, that one of Hoodie's design goals is to make its use attractive and intuitive to beginners and non-professionals. And we came up with a process to help us achieve this, and we call it Dreamcode. And that slide doesn't do it justice, so there's a second slide. So when we designed the initial API for our no backend thing, we each sat down and wrote hypothetical apps that worked with a fictional no backend API that didn't exist yet, and which reflected what we thought were the most intuitive, simple, and sensible ways of working. So we didn't start with the system's capabilities and then expose them to the user. We started with the user's requirements and built backwards from there because we wanted people to have a good experience with it. So essentially, Dreamcode is user-centered design for APIs. And for this was really crucial because our target audience for 1.0 isn't developers like us. We are also aiming for the non-developers, the non-professionals, the beginners, the amateurs, those who can just barely get along with jQuery. That's cool. We just want to give them more power. So we've made data-driven app development so much simpler and more convenient, it would be a huge waste not to try and broaden the scope of the audience that we're addressing. We want the power, simplicity, and accessibility of Smalltalk and HyperCard in the web realm. But what this ends up meaning is that we are designers, like we and developers, we are designers. Not in the way you think I mean this differently. So we need to know the fundamentals of design process and design thinking, but not because we need nice websites for our projects or nicely typeset documentation pages, but because using what we build, from finding it to learning about it, to getting it running, to working with it, to failing with it, to asking for help with it, succeeding with it, all of that is user experience. We are experience designers. We shape how people experience what we make. And it pays off to design towards that experience because that's what Google and Apple and Facebook do, and what developers left to themselves tend to forget. And I know this from myself as well. So how many brilliant engineering projects are there on the web that go underused and ignored because the engineer at some point thought, well, I didn't have a 3-point getting started guide, why should anybody else? I suffered for this knowledge, and so should you. And that's not a good attitude, because we're experienced designers whether we like it or not. As programmers, what we produce needs to be designed to the user's needs, and how you present it needs to be tailored to an intended audience. And that audience is far too often the one person who wrote the damn thing. It needs to offer a good user experience, even if it's just a snippet of code on a gist somewhere. People are going to use it. And that's just a matter of economy, too, because every time a developer saves time by leaving in something dodgy or obtuse or not immediately obvious, that time gets wasted dozens of hundreds of times over by the people who have to try and figure it out first. In short, make it easier. In even shorter, don't believe in trickle-down technology. In technology, some of us share a similar philosophy to trickle-down economics, which says that if we help the people at the top, somehow everything will just trickle down, and the people who aren't as savvy as we are will somehow benefit from it. But just like trickle-down economics, that doesn't work. So we can revel in this idea of the open web, and it's all well and good, but at the moment that open web is like an open window in the second story, and you have to bring your own ladder. It's not for everyone. And I think no backend is a great opportunity to help more people shape the web. And you don't have to worry about your job and your status. I mean, these technologies are not complete replacements for any tech stack, or it's not a magical solution that will make your engineering department disappear overnight. It's just another solution that aims to be more open and brings a number of promising benefits that are good for the web, good for us, and in the end, good for everyone. So to recap, what is no backend? It's technology that brings speed, simplicity, and flexibility to web app development, not just for us, but to everyone. It liberates and empowers by simplifying development and lowering the barriers of entry massively. It's tech that can distribute applications and kill data silos. It's tech that can make the web the platform for entry-level general-purpose computing and learning about code by making getting started with the whole thing much easier. And in the end, it's also tech that requires us to think more like product managers and designers so we can build good experiences for other humans, which is the whole point. And all of these things are good things. It's our job to make making the web more accessible to more people. That is our power, and nobody else is going to do this, I think. If we can help people understand the web, they can make the web, and if they make the web, they will care about it more. And the more people care about, understand, and make the web, the better we'll all be. Better off we'll all be. Thanks.